And welcome everyone to today's Synergist webinar, How to Collect and Present Performance Metrics for Your Industrial Hygiene Program. I'm Ed Rutkowski, editor of the Synergist, the magazine of AIHA. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially Velocity EHS for sponsoring this webinar. Today's speaker is Dave Reese, the Principal Solution Strategist of Industrial Hygiene at Velocity EHS. Dave is a board-certified industrial hygienist and safety professional with over 30 years of EHS experience. He started his career as a senior industrial hygienist for Exxon before moving to Oracle to help build their EHS application. In 2001, Dave acquired the application and formed Pyramid to bring it to the broader marketplace, expanding its use to over 60 countries. In 2019, Velocity EHS acquired Pyramid and brought Dave in to oversee the industrial hygiene solution. Dave has a bachelor's degree in occupational safety and health from Ferris State University and a master's in industrial hygiene from UCLA. Now, I'll turn the presentation over to Dave.
Thanks, Ed. Share my screen. Go, present. Excellent. So thank you all for attending the webinar. When we were putting this together, I really wanted to bring more value to everybody attending. I could have showed up and just had a bunch of examples and said, here's a bunch of metrics and here's for industrial hygiene, some things you might want to think about. But I really wanted to educate all of you to kind of look more on a holistic program. So I broke it up into four sections. One is the basics of metrics. What are they? Why are they important? That's just a couple slides, since I think most of us agree they are important. Then I'll go through some different types of metrics. There's probably some types of metrics that you have not seen before, and I'll review those. And the next two parts of the parts that I think you get the most value out of is when you look at a metrics program and building metrics, those two topics, we don't really get educated on that in most of our industrial hygiene programs, and most people just have a fancy dashboard and they just build out some metrics and say, this is great. I'll walk you through a really detailed how to build metrics with some good examples that we can walk through, and then we'll talk about how to build out the program and how to manage the program so it's evergreen. I'll try to leave about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions, so if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and at the end Ed will grab those questions and we'll find time to go through those. So let's dive into metrics. So what are metrics? They're a measure of past performance and a means to chart and predict future progress, specifically for your IH program. They're not just a fancy graph. It actually has meanings. It's a resource for making informed decisions. It's not meant to, it's really meant to identify areas for actions to ensure compliance, which is great, but also more importantly to meet your performance goals, which is something I think we can all improve on, is how do we best illustrate the value of our IH program or EHS program. So to accomplish these benefits, metrics must be accurate, consistently measured, comparable, meaning, if you're looking at a metric compared to one site over another site, or location to location, or geography to geography, or if you do benchmarking from company to company, it's got to be reproducible, obviously relevant, and actionable. So why should we measure performance? We might use it to evaluate or monitor the progress of your IH program. We use it to track your achievement of your goals for your EHS or IH program. You can use it to compare or benchmark, which I mentioned earlier. I personally love it to demonstrate actions to management or your key stakeholders, and increasing management involvement. The more they're engaged, the more they're um, included in setting these goals and working these goals. The more they're going to be there to support you. And I'll go into that a lot more of that here in a few minutes. But the number one reason really is to change behaviors. The reason for a metric is it forces people to change their behaviors to meet whatever that metric is. So that way you can focus your efforts on behavior and in some cases cultural change within your company, i.e., how's IH viewed within your company. So with that brief introduction, let's jump into some good examples. We all know leading versus lagging indicators, but how does that relate to industrial hygiene? When you're looking at leading indicators, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to measure either, like actual versus planned activities. So are you looking at your count or a percent completion of your planned qualitative exposure assessments, number or percent of your monitoring data that exceeds OELs, PPEs worn properly or not. So if you've got engineering or preventative maintenance programs, what's the percentage of those PM programs on any exposure controls that are in place? That's something that I've seen a couple companies use that has been very effective. And of course, you can look at the number of people in medical surveillance programs. These are all indicators of risk. Lagging. The biggest problem with lagging is that most of our exposures and there's a longer latency period. It's not like safety where you have injuries immediately. Latency period, you have to wait for years. So for the hearing loss, for the cancer, for the abnormal health outcomes, you got to wait for those. So lagging indicators, yes, they're helpful, but the damage has already been done. So I would focus more on the leading indicators. There's a concept called value or ROI metrics, and basically what you're doing is you're assigning monetary value to IH and you're deriving hard return on investment numbers. The pros of it, I really like the concept because you're talking the languages of the business. It has clear meaning to the key stakeholders, and it can be directly linked to business objectives. So it can really be a powerful decision tool early on. The cons, which I think tend over time to outweigh the pros, is you're putting value, you're getting away from the value of what EHS and IH do, and you're making it the bottom line dollar. So yes, it's talking business, and that's great. But what happens if you get your metrics are all really low? So you got things under control, but your cost for your IH program is stayed the same, but you've reduced the impact. You've reduced, so your ROI becomes less because the cost to do it's the same, and I'm getting less quote unquote return on my investment. So what happens over time is your ROI numbers get to the point where they're like, well, do we really need this many industrial hygienists? Can we outsource it? Can we make the safety people or lower cost individuals do the same work? So that's kind of one kind of thing that I wanted to make sure that I covered here. So be careful when you're using these, not to back yourself in a corner. Where I've seen these very effective is if it's a new program that has a very high incidence of exceedances or a lot of people in the medical surveillance programs, or if you're starting off a new project, these numbers are fantastic, but over the course of time, as your program gets better and better, the numbers don't start to work in your favor. This next one I like because you can use both leading and lagging indicators, and it's a blended or what's called a composite metrics. And basically what you do is you list out your measurements. So here we're looking at qualitative exposure assessments completed and the other two. And then we weight, I'm sorry, before we get the weighting, there's a status of completion. So 70% of my qualitative exposure assessments are done. 80% of my sampling plan is completed for that time period, that month, that year, that quarter, whatever it might be. And 90% of the medical tests that have been performed came back to be negative. And then we put a simple weighting to it. Again, there's no hard, fast rule on this. Just where do you put the value of your efforts or your metrics? So you assign a value that should add up to a 1.0. So you split up 1.0 into those numbers. Then you simply do a multiplication, which gives you a score, and then you summarize that score. The score number is just a number. So if I've got more metrics in there, I've got more line items, I'm going to have a higher score. Whatever that number is, put it into bands. I suggest keeping it simple, green, yellow, red, and your IH team activities in your blended and composite metric is 109, which makes it to, I'll say, the green. And what's nice about this is now this can be used to answer kind of what's the status of your IH program at your company, or you can individualize this per location or per business unit, wherever it makes sense on how you want to assess where you're at today versus others. It's a really good tool to assess the program at one location versus another location. Balanced scorecard, very complex. You can make this thing as complex as you want. This one I made a little bit more complex than I think most I've seen out there, but it's a great way to assess your progress and your success and your status of your IH program at each location. So I see my cursors out here. My example is a Houston refinery, and I've got, SEG with 2 metrics. I got qualitative assessments. I got these metrics, sampling plan, monitoring data, and then feedback. So I got all of these metrics that I've defined. There's got to be an owner. So who's the person that's responsible to collect this data? What's the target? So what's the goal? What's the actual? So, our goal is 90, but we're at 80% of SEGs up to date for initial site characterizations. And then here, the trend lines is kind of cool. Arrow to the right means that you're just kind of, you're treading water, you're staying the same. Red down means obviously you're getting worse. Green up means you're getting better from the last time period. Again, you got to set the standard on this is are we going to update this thing every month, every quarter? And for that, you got to ask yourself, how often does this data change? Does it make sense to do this thing weekly? Probably not. Once a month, maybe. Once a quarter, probably. And then where are you as far as kind of green, yellow, red versus, actual versus target? So you can see here quickly, where the reds are, where you need to focus some attention to say, wow, I'm only at 50% of where I need to be for this item. And then you put in any notes or action items in there. Okay. Again, this is just a good example. What I like about this thing here is, again, I can have a scorecard for each of my locations and look at if I'm a business unit level, hygiene or corporate IH, I can look at where all my sites are, where are they improving, are they, where are they versus target, green, yellow, red. Gives them a lot of really good information all on one sheet. Pareto, or what's called a perception questionnaire. I'm sure most of you have seen this. They put out a statement like, I believe industrial hygiene program is effective and protects me. and you get a scale, and the person taking that questionnaire just says, oh, I strongly disagree because I don't even know what the heck this is, versus I strongly agree, or somewhere in the middle, and they rate you based on their perception of you. Really easy to do, but then you got to think through how to present it. A lot of people just throw up a graph like this, and you can see that, okay, it's neutral or it's agree, it looks pretty good. I would take the next step and say, well, this is good, but I want a hard number. So if I've got 20 locations and I ask 20 locations what this is, I want to have a hard number so I can compare those two. If I have 20 locations and 20 of these graphs, how do I compare that? So I would actually take that number, all the responses, and I would just average it and say the average for this location is a 3.8. Again, keeping to the green, yellow, red, keeping it simple. That makes it a yellow, let's say, less than a 3 gives it a red, and maybe a 4 greater gives it a green, let's say. And that way you can assess really quickly from a lot of data where you're at with just one simple number. Our qualitative exposure assessment risk matrix, this is something that I harp on a lot. This is my personal favorite. What I love about this is once I've gone out and I've laid out my similar exposure groups, I've done all my qualitative assessments. Now I take all of that information and I roll it into a risk matrix. So the risk matrix, if you're at a company that uses these, it might be safety, it might be quality, it might be production, operations, whatever they use, jump on the bandwagon and use what they use. So in my example, my safety department has a risk matrix that is very well known. Management knows it, the employees know it. It's really well known. It's three colors. It's a 4x4 matrix for safety. They're looking at severity and likelihood, but I'm going to convert that into health effect rating and exposure rating. And then I'm just going to do a count of where the SAGs and stressors meet. Okay. Then once you're presenting this to management and you lay that out, they're like, hey, there's these things in the red. I don't like things in the red. How do we get rid of the reds? Now you got their attention, and now you can take the next step saying, well, if you need to make these zeros, we can put up these control methods. We can, not really PPE, but you could jump into administrative controls, engineering controls, ventilation controls to reduce that and say, well, if for X amount of investment, this is what your numbers would look like. So it just enables you to relate something that they know, which is like a safety risk matrix, to industrial hygiene. They'll make the connection. They're like, okay, so you're basically the same as safety, but you're looking at health exposure, health risk versus safety risk. You're like, you got it, great. And then you can talk through, how to get rid of your reds. So a quick word on dashboards. A lot of software companies have these. They're really handy. They're slick. They look really nice. But definitely, before you jump in and start using what they have available, I would say take a step back and figure out what it is that makes sense to you guys. When you're looking at a software vendor or a metrics, there's a lot of business intelligence tools out there. The things I would look for is it up to date with technology? A lot of stuff, these started coming out 10, 15 years ago. Some of the BI tools I've seen out there haven't really progressed. They're very clunky. So make sure that the technology, the functionalities kept up to date. Also make sure that it's cloud-based, because you want it really easy to share among users and your key stakeholders. Make sure it's simple and intuitive. You shouldn't have to go through retraining on these things. It should be very intuitive. I can change, all the different, what they call widgets, or the different graphs. If I wanted this to-do list over here, I should be able to click and drag it over here. I should be able to click in here and change the metrics or the filters I want. I should be able to move it all around and customize it the way I want it to. And then preferably, if you're looking at a graph but you want to drill into the data, maybe I would click on this top item here, and then it would drill down into that data and show me additional data. So dashboards are great. It's a great way to get to some basic metrics, but it doesn't solve the whole solution. And work with your software vendor to say, well, here's the metrics that we've designed. Here's what's important to us. Can we add those to the dashboard tool or to the widgets? Okay, so now that we've seen some good examples, I want to jump into some, now that we've seen some good examples of some different type of metrics, how do we actually build them? So let's jump into this. This is a 5-step process that I've seen presented a lot of different ways, and I've seen a 7-step, 8-step, 4-step. I like the 5-step. It works out. It just makes a lot of sense to me. Most of us, including myself, when I worked in industry, I would jump right into the analysis tool, and I would jump in and I'd start doing stats, and I'm like, look at all this great stuff, and it was wonderful, but nobody understood it except for us hygienists. So let's take a step back and go through a process where you go through and you actually define the goal. The goal, it could be a business goal, it could be an IH program goal. Define the goals that you have for your IH program. Then your next step is for each one of those goals, you want to identify questions to see whether you're hitting those goals. And once you ask that question, then you go to the third step that says, okay, what tool am I going to use, or what stat am I going to generate that's going to answer that question? And then once I lay out those three, then I go out into the stat tool and all my stat tools and Bayesian tools, and I started having fun with all these tools, and now I get to the raw data and everything else. And then the next step is probably where most of us fail, I should say, is you just throw out a graphic out there. So we'll discuss in great detail all different types of graphics and all different ways to throw it out there to elicit you to think a little bit more than just throwing out a stat or throwing out a number. Use graphics, use colors, you use a lot of things just to make life a lot simpler. And this is what I used to do, is you'd grab a sheet like your IH stat spreadsheet that I'm sure most of you have used. You punch in the OEL, you punch in all your sample data, you generate all these graphs, charts. You're like, hey, look at this. This is great. And you present it to a key stakeholder, and they look at this and they're like, these people are geeks. I don't know what they're talking about. I don't understand. These are numbers. It doesn't speak to me. So think of the iStat tool and other tools. Wonderful, great tools. Use them all the time. But they're analysis tools. They're not a shareable metric. So quick review. How do we actually go out and build those metrics? You look at the goals and questions. So you might be interested in looking at seg confirmations. Are my segs truly similar or homogeneous? Exposure rating. So we've gone out and done a lot of exposure ratings. We got the health effect rating nailed, but the exposure ratings, are they consistent across sites? Are the exposure rating that I'm doing, are they accurate? You can have some metrics to show how well you're performing. Compliance, again, are you in compliance with action levels, OELs, PELs, and then control verifications. What defines control would be the question I've had with some folks over the years, because when I'm talking to like an aggregate company or a mining company, they're looking at nuisance dust or maybe silica, that level of control versus someone in the pharmaceutical market industry where you got high potency compounds, their level of control is going to be a lot more granular and detailed than just maintaining some kind of, reducing the level of dust. Then you can go through, once you define your goals and questions, what's the method? So what's the tool you're going to use? What's the calculation stat you're going to use? You perform the analysis. And lastly, you actually present an easy to understand metric. So let's go through some examples. The first one here, seg confirmation is my goal. I want to confirm that my segs are truly segs. So the question I'm asking is, are my segs homogeneous or similar? I can do this without a lot of, fancy stats and everything else. I can do it through a visual. So I can do a little scatter diagram, and I could check, I've got all my benzene exposures at this location and these coworkers that work in this area. And I just got my concentration here, and on the x-axis, I've got my sample duration. So I've got some STEL samples. They're all pretty much combined. I can look at the data points and say, yep, those are all, that's a cluster. So that would be one similar exposure grouping of data. But then when I look at full shift, just simply plotting them really puts two nice clusters together. So then you look at that and say, okay, well, that's not a similar exposure group. My full shift exposures, I need to look at why those are different. And I could look at, it might be their location, their process, it might be the equipment that they're working with. Like, for instance, this might be a really old paint booth, and this might be a really new paint booth. A lot better ventilation, a lot better controls. But at least here, I can do a quick and dirty without any stats and do a visual and dive into my data. Now, what the majority of people might want to look at is their geometric standard deviation. And matter of fact, it's referenced in AIHA's strategy for assessing and managing occupational exposures, is that GSD less than 3 is generally considered to be homogeneous. So you take your data, you throw it into my tool. Here's the tool I'm going to use, and specifically I'm going to look at the geometric standard deviation, and my metric is 3. So if I see a number less than 3, then I've met my goal. Okay, so I've identified my goal, my question, the metric I'm looking at, the tool I'm going to use, but how do I present it? A lot of different ways. Let me just bounce some ideas off you. I could put it into a table and list all of the segs here and the stressor and seg combination and show the geometric standard deviation. And I could put them in the bands. Again, I'm a simple guy, green, yellow, red. And if it's a red, it's higher than a 3. So seg number 3 for benzene is not homogeneous. There's some issues there. I need to dive into my data. Seg number 2 is questionable, and segs 1, well, the other ones that are green, I could say, yes, I feel good about those. I can also take that data and put it into a graph, and I got a red dotted line there that shows quickly, you can quickly view that and say, oh, okay, one of those exceeds 3. So I look at seg number 3 for benzene and figure out, well, that's not homogeneous. So I could, that's another way to quickly identify the data point, or I could put it into an actual metric that I could share. So I could put it into a box and say that 20% of my segs have segs greater than 3.0. But I don't like that because it's a negative and it's a little technical. GSD greater than 3.0. If you're not in industrial hygiene or you've done some stats, you're probably not going to know or care what that means. So let's go back to our original question, our original goal. A better way to probably state that is, well, 80% of our segs are confirmed. And I might make that a green because 80% or higher might make sense to me. But this is a lot simpler. You don't have to be a statistician or a hygienist to understand what that means. You're saying, hey, our similar exposure groups, 80% of them are good. Another example, we're looking at exposure compliance. And the question is, are we in compliance with the OELs? Again, I'm going to use a simple tool, the AI stat tool, but I'm looking at a different metric now. Here, I'm going to use the 95th percentile. If I'm in the pharmaceutical industry or chemical industry where you're dealing with high potency compounds, I might drop down and use the 95-95 UTL. It really depends on my decision, but make sure you document that precision. So if it's 95th percentile for 95% of our stressors, here we go. This is the stats we're going to use. Document that. For these high potency compounds, we're going to move more towards the 95-95. Once I've done the analysis, I can graph it like this. And a couple notes on this graph. The first thing I did was I normalized the actual results to a time to a percent of the OEL. So what's great about that is now I can look at different stressors across on the same chart. So the OELs might be different, but I'm looking at a percent of the OEL. So now I can have them all on one chart. Just makes analyzing it a lot simpler. I can have the red dotted line here for the OEL, and if I want to even put in a yellow line for the action level, I can throw that in there. And I can present that even more simpler by saying, you know, if I'm looking at the action levels, I can say 80% of our exposures are less than the action level. Or let's say I wanted to look at the OELs, I could say, okay, 0% of our exposures are greater than the OEL. Me personally, going back to what my question was or what my goal was, it's probably better stated, we're in 100% exposure compliance or compliance with exposures, or however we want to word that. Again, key stakeholders, management, some of the workers might not know what OEL is, and it might confuse them. If you're saying that you're in 100% exposure compliance, that's something that is going to be a lot better understood. Trend lines, I want to just show this so we can talk about it real quick. Trending is important, but for who? If you show this graph, which I've seen a lot of hygienists showing this graph to key stakeholders, and they look at that and they go, okay, the trend's going down, but where are we now? You know, it's good to see the trend's going down, but where are we? They're going to look more towards this green box to say, are we in compliance or not? That's all they really want to know. So I would look at a trend line like what I'm showing as more of a really good tool, more for EHS professionals, industrial hygienists, to see what your trend is, because you're going to understand the state a lot more than, you know, management or workers might. Or if you wanted to take this trend data here and come up with a simple metric here that says you've reduced it by X amount on average per year, great. But showing just a graphic like this, I think it's too complicated for most. Okay, so we're going to jump into establishing a metrics program and building out all these great metrics really won't mean a damn thing unless there's buy-in from your key stakeholders. We need to get out of our black boxes, share our progress or our process, and the value that we bring to the organizations. So we need to get buy-in. So the first way to get buy-in is you need to collaborate and educate key stakeholders. When possible, align your metrics with the goals of the business, so that way they can better understand what value we can bring to the business. And if we do it correctly, they become an ally to support our program, our IH program, our IH metrics program. And that could be, you know, literally supporting the actual program, or also financially gathering additional data points, hiring consultants. If you need additional budget and they've signed on for your metrics program, they're going to help support you. They're going to be more apt to support you financially. Okay. I can't stand up here and tell you what the best metrics is for your organizations. You really need to sit down and figure it out for yourself. But you do that by following the 5-step process. So start with the goals. Is your goal like to reduce illness? Well, that's great. How are we going to do that? What are the questions that we're going to look at? And here's just a handful of them. You can look at hazard elimination, qualitative exposure assessments, plan versus completed, samples that you've collected versus planned, training activities, obviously is a valid one. Corrective action. So of the corrective actions that were recommended, how many were done on time, or how many have been completed at all? And I mentioned this earlier, but scheduled maintenance and preventative maintenance programs on key engineering controls is something that a lot of people miss. So I would definitely consider that as being a really good metric. And that spreads, that kind of shares the wealth, and it kind of hooks in the maintenance department to be part of your team, because obviously they don't want to look bad, they want to look good. And if they know that they're being measured, you're actually modifying their mindset. Say, okay, this is going to be measured, guys, so we need to make sure we're going back and checking the ventilation, checking the lab hoods, checking the whatever the control methodology is. And then another thing that you might want to look at is greater employee engagement. This could be participation in safety committee meetings, training sessions, and other EHS activities. The number of employees suggesting ideas in the ideas box that are IH related. Excuse me. And you can also do a Pareto survey that says, what's their knowledge or what's their attitude towards the IH program. So a couple points on establishing benchmarks and performance targets. Benchmarking is fantastic if it's done right. Try to put all of your benchmarking data in a quantitative format. Pareto is probably not the best way to do it, but make sure that it's objective data that can be quantitative consistently across your different groups that are being benchmarked. Make sure it's comparable. So if you're looking at the same type of industry, I would also look at the size of each plant. The plant size might make a difference, or the location. If it's in a third world country where they're more concerned about sanitation rather than long-term chronic exposures, that might not be a good candidate for benchmarking. And make sure you have enough sample size to make sure it's statistically valid data that you have. Managing and improving each performance requires setting targets. So performance targets, you need to define how aggressive you want to be on these goals. Some people, I've seen some people set goals saying we're going to be, 0 incident rates. We're going to have 0 exposures greater than the OEL. We're going to, if you set those as your targets, you're setting yourself up for failure in most environments. So look at where you're currently at and look at the time frame. Hey, this is the first year we're doing this. We got a brand new IH program. We just wrote it for the first time. The previous hygienists or EHS professionals they couldn't spell IH, so we're putting this together from scratch. Set realistic targets, and again, get the key stakeholders involved to make sure that you got the right resources. if you're saying you're going to go out and you're going to do all these qualitative exposure assessments and you're one person with 400 locations, how's it going to get done? Oh, we're going to use consultants. Okay. Do you have a budget to pay for those consultants to go all 400 locations? Those are the things you got to, make sure you got the staffing, the budget, the timeline, and then be realistic in how you set those up. So maybe you, instead of saying 100% compliance, maybe year one is you're going to establish a baseline for all your locations to see where you're even at. Year two, you might set a reduction of number of segs or number of samples exceeding OEL by 10%, or you might, whatever that metric is, be realistic and don't set your performance targets too aggressive. So before jumping into creating metrics, it's critical that we got to document every decision, such as who's responsible to collect, compile, analyze, report all of your metrics. What are the sources of data? So where are we going to get this data? What data are we going to be collecting? How are we going to be collecting it? How are we going to be analyzing it? The tools and how we're going to analyze it. So we're going to use, these freeware tools, but here's the stats that we're going to use. The frequency. Once again, if things don't change that often, weekly, don't try to analyze this stuff weekly. Wait until there's enough data or time where you're going to see a little change for the good or the worse. So it might be monthly, it might be quarterly, it might be annually. And then document down what that data collection and management procedures are. Then you got to put together an action plan, and the action plan is really set up to help launch a metrics program. Like I said, document everything, make sure everybody's on the same page. You want to reduce confusion, especially at the start. I kind of beat this up a lot, is set realistic expectations. Rome wasn't built in a day. You're not going to be at 100% full compliance, chances are, right out of the box. So make sure that you're being realistic on those targets, and be prepared to miss deadlines and have setbacks. This is, again, the reason why you'd want to have a team. And a team should not be all EHS professionals or industrial hygienists. You should have people in operations or other key stakeholders. Number one, they need to relate. They need to understand why the deadlines are missed, or why there's setbacks, or why the numbers aren't really making the targets. But as importantly, you're going to run into rough spots, and it might be budgeting, it might be resources, it might be, who knows what happens. But if you've got key stakeholders from other departments involved with this, they got skin in the game, they're going to be there to support you. And program review, a lot of people skip this step. They just go off and they throw out some metrics, throw it out there, and it's a set it and forget it kind of thing. And this is a process. This is not a set it and forget it item. You need to remove metrics that no longer provide value to the organization. This happens more than most people think it can. Your metrics are going to change because your IT program gets better, your precision gets better, hopefully the exposures get lower. If there's a metric that you're at 100% over the course of every single month for the course of 2-3 years, that might be a metric that you might not even care. People know we're going to be at 100% of that. Let's change that metric. Let's get something. Let's replace that with something that's going to be more valuable. It also might be a metric that needs to be modified or changed. So maybe you set your target way too aggressive, or your banding on green, yellow, red might have been way too aggressive. So now we're going to adjust that a little bit. Not that you want to bias the data, but you want to make sure that once you start collecting data, you're going to start to see trends in that data, and you're going to be better qualified, you'll have more information to set the bands. If that makes sense. Benchmarking, you find time to benchmark with your peers in industry, whether it be within your company at different locations or other companies in your industry. If you reach outside of your company, I like it because it really gives you some ideas for best practices to enable you to fine tune your program that might have a metric or a goal that they have that you might not have thought of, and vice versa. And then over time, so with a metric, the ultimate goal with a metric is really to change behavior. So if you had a metric out there for years and people have, trying to think of an example, we want to go out and collect the GHAs, or I'll call them near misses. Near miss reporting is a really big deal. We want all the near miss reports. So you educate all these people on near miss reports. They start collecting a couple near miss reports. Over the course of time, it becomes a habit to just, pump the inbox full of these things to look good, right? I'm changing behavior. I'm doing a bunch of near miss reports, but now the quality of the near miss reports might not be good. Well, if that's the case, I'm hitting my numbers, but people are just putting garbage in, then let's change the metric. So maybe you might change it from the count of near miss reports to the quality of that near miss reports. And so over time, you're going to have to look at your data, because all data becomes biased over time. So continue to monitor that. Once you start seeing bias or data that people are just pumping it full because that's what you're measuring, change what you're measuring. Typically, you're going from a numbers to a quality, but you need to be monitoring that. Okay, and then the summary, your metrics are unique. They're unique to your organization, the size of your company, the status of where your program's at. There's no one size fits all. I'm not going to throw up a bunch of metrics and say, here, guys, just download these and apply these, because what makes sense to one organization might not make sense to another one. You must engage with key stakeholders. I think I beat that up really hard, and kind of the benefits of getting them engaged, getting their buy-in, getting their support, both financially and politically, is critical. As much as possible, align your metrics with the organization's greater business goals. That's going to give you a lot more attention at the executive levels. If you follow the process, goals, define your goals, figure out what question to ask to see if you met that goal, and then to answer that question, what tool and what stat are you going to use, and then do the analysis and figure out what graphic best represents going back to that question and that goal. And again, the concept is keeping it simple. If I have it down to a simple green, yellow, red box with a number, perfect. Not all metrics can get that simplified, but that should be your goal, is to make it really apparent to anybody reading that, whether you met that goal or not. And when you have the data done, I think I beat it up. You want to present that metrics that answers that actual question, and then document everything in a plan and do the periodic reviews so you can adjust as it's needed, and keep your data fresh, keep your metrics program fresh, and keep the value that you're bringing to the organization fresh. And I left about 10 minutes here. So with that, I'm going to pause and kick it back over to Ed. Oh, before I jump in there, Ed, I'll leave this on here. If there's questions we can't get to, or if you just want to reach out to me privately, this is my email, dreese@ehs.com. I get questions every week from other webinars I give and everything else, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks, Dave. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat window on the right side of your screen and send it to everyone. Our first question today is, can you do a blended or composite metric for each location or plant and compare them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the benefits of that composite is once you go through and define what's important for you and what your numbering is, and here's, we're going to multiply the numbers this way and come up with a set number. Once you set those standards, then you just apply that standard to every site, and that truly gets you to the point where you're looking at apples to apples. And if you wanted to take it a next step further, you could use those numbers each month. Let's say you report on every month, you could put that into a trend chart to show how sites are improving or getting worse on their IH programs. Great question.
Okay, thanks. Jennifer has a question. Does the Velocity EHS IH module have the ability to compile data into graphs, et cetera?
Yeah, we do it in a litany of different ways. There are graphs and charts and things like that embedded in the application, but where a lot of our companies, what they prefer is they prefer to get the data to generate the charts that are important for them. So we've got a tool that takes the data, dumps it into a data lake. I'm gonna say this, it provides the data in a format that you can put a reporting tool on top of it and generate the graphs, charts, metrics, whatever you're looking to do. That way you're not locked into, the 10 reports that we have or the 50 reports that we have. You can get to the raw data and generate the metrics that make sense for your organization.
Okay. The next question is from Lauren, and she asks, what would you recommend for initial metrics for an organization with an IH program in its infancy?
Whew, that's a good one. I would look at, so the first thing you have to do is set up a baseline of risk, right? You're going to go out and you're going to say, I haven't done my site characterizations. I don't know where the risks are. So you might break up those risks. I've seen one approach where they looked at and said, we're just going to look at full shift exposures, and I'm going to measure and do a baseline assessment at all of my locations. So the metric might be, okay, the goal is to do baseline assessments. Here's the ones that we have planned. Here's how many we've completed. Here's where we are, completed versus planned. So 80% is done of the baseline assessments. And then once you have that data, now I can set up baseline risk from a qualitative side. I can do my stats analysis and say, okay, the data shows me, this kind of level of exposure. It might be that you're somewhere between the action level and the OEL, so we need to investigate more, but here's 70% of my data I've collected in qualitative exposure assessments I've done on my baseline assessments show that there's no there. So I'm going to document all of those, doing my negative exposure documentation and document it fully for litigation support 20 years down the road. But now I'm going to focus in on that remaining 30%. And then year 2, you can go in there and say, okay, we're going to have more metrics because now we're going to go back and collect more data on these items. So here's our sampling plan. And now I can measure, we got 120 samples and where are we versus plan for the year. So yeah, short answer is I would look at the baseline site characterization baseline risk assessments, and then let the data drive your metrics year to year.
Okay, thanks, Dave. There's a question from Miriam who asks, when we only have safer working procedures as control measures, how can we illustrate the results of their efficiency?
I would document the data. If you're out there collecting data, and let's say you're might be a working method that says use wet methods for when you're working around silica, or when you're doing a certain dusty environment, use wet methods to control the dust. If you've got data showing with and without those controls in place, or those activities truly being used, that's invaluable data. A friend of mine in the aggregate industry used that about 10 years ago, and he just went back to management and said, well, you know, we always harp on wet methods. Here's the difference. And when you show it on a graph with controls or without controls, with wet methods or with the following the procedures properly versus not following them, what the exposure levels are, that's a great education for the workers, and it's a great way for management to really see the benefit of following those procedures.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Kayla asks, have you seen success integrating with total worker health initiatives?
Yeah, we're diving into that pretty heavy. Total worker health is evolving. I personally believe it's going to be sucked up into the ESG world. If you haven't heard of ESG, definitely Google it and learn about it, because that's going to be the something that we're all going to have to know more about. I definitely see it happening. I see occupational health and hygienists working closer together because of total worker health. Definitely.
Okay. Alex asks, is it possible to roll out the Velocity EHS IH application at a single site and then extend it to a larger network of about 50 sites?
Yeah, we do that all the time. We're onboarding customers every week, and some folks do it globally. Some folks, we have customers from 400 employees all the way up to hundreds of thousands. So yeah, it's a system that was built to be pliable for a single location or a global enterprise.
Okay, and I believe this will have to be our last question from Adam, who asks, do you have a recommended report format? For example, start with the scope and then have an executive staff summary and then go into a background.
Oh, a report. I would have to know more about that question. Are we talking qualitative exposure assessments where you're defining maybe your SEGs, then the risk assessments down, or is it from a monitoring perspective? If that person can send me an email on that and give me a little bit more details, I can try to respond with a little bit.
Sure. He just clarified that he's talking about quantitative stuff.
Oh, he's talking quantitative?
Yes.
Okay. So on the quantitative side, we've looked at this, oh gosh, over the last 25 years, coming up with a standard IH report where it takes all the data and lumps it into a report, formats it, and you hit a button that generates 90% of it. We actually tried to do that going back about 15 years ago, and the group that we were working with couldn't. It's the old question, or old joke, if you get 20 hygienists in a room, you can't decide what you're going to have for lunch. Try to come up with a standard format for an IH report. So technically, can it be done? Yes. Part of our user group still looking at it. What we've done is we've taken steps to say, okay, let's do what we can agree on. We can agree on that spread table that everybody has to generate. So why don't we click one button and generate that report? Employee notification letters, anything that's a standard part of those reports. We built really quick and easy ways to generate those tables, and you can copy and paste them in a Word and generate your reports that way. But no, if whoever that is wants to come on board and help drive that out, I mean, that's kind of the holy grail of if we can find an easy way to do that, I would love to do it.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. My thanks to Dave Reese for his presentation, to Velocity EHS for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our participants. We're planning more Synergist webinars for this fall, so please check aiha.webvent.tv for updates, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Right, this was great. This actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. The recording will be available at aiha.webvent.tv. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with that link. And please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.